Good afternoon, my beautiful babes and babettes. I am your resident active idiot, and not too dissimilar from active advocate, but the reason why I say that is because the first time I tried to make this video, I forgot to hit record. So yeah, that was sort of bad, because I spent like half an hour on the thing. But I apologize also for my lack of video yesterday. I had a barometric pressure headache. I get those sometimes before a storm, and it's really difficult to concentrate when it feels like someone has their hands pressed against the sides of your head. Fun, but I am back today and tomorrow. However, be forewarned, I am taking next week off, probably. Or if I don't take the full week off, videos are going to be spotty because my mother has the week off. Yay! And I get to spend time with her. Yay! And we get to see my aunt for the first time in like a year and a half. She's my favorite aunt. I love this woman, and we've been missing each other. So, well, go for a girls' date out. Woohoo, it's gonna be fun. But yeah, with that in mind, I may not have any videos next week. We will see, however. And also the Monday following that, my mother also has off. So that is going to be a thing as well. All right, with my disclaimers out of the way, however, let us maximize our lovely document and continue reading from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So pretty. It's so pretty. It really is. All right. So this will be calls to action, by the way, numbers 26 through 30. And here we go. We call upon the federal, provincial, and territorial governments to review and amend their respective statutes of limitations to ensure that they conform to the principle that governments and other entities cannot rely on limitation defenses to defend legal actions of historical abuse brought by Aboriginal people. All right. For those of you who don't know, and oh my god, I actually know what I'm talking about here. I was concerned about that. But a statute of limitations for a crime is the date past which you can no longer be charged for that crime. I do not know whether in Canada or in any other country there is a statute of limitations on the crime of genocide, but the thing here is that legally people are going to have more wiggle room if they do not define what happened at the residential schools as genocide and or ethnocide. Those are two different things, but genocide is to eliminate the genocide. So it's to eliminate the gene pool. Whereas ethnocide, ethnic, is to eliminate an ethnicity, not necessarily the person, but the person's culture. However, both of those things, genocide and ethnocide, occurred within the residential schools. As I say, I don't know whether in Canada or America where these schools were, there is a statute of limitations on genocide or ethnocide, but if they are not defined as such, if the crimes that were committed in the residential schools are not defined as such, there is going to be wiggle room for the people involved in these things who are still living. In Canada, as I have said before, the last residential school we had closed in 1997. So presumably quite a number of the people involved in this system are still going to be alive. There's been debate circulating on the internet that the Catholic Church, particularly, should be put on trial and held accountable for their actions with the residential schools, because 3 of them that have been, dug up thus far within the past few weeks and months, all 3 of them belonged to the Catholic Church and were under the church's jurisdiction. I don't know whether all of the schools were run by the Catholic Church. I don't believe they were, But one of the points of these places was to convert the children to the respective denomination of Christianity that that ran the school. So personally, it's only because I'm very anti-institutional religion, like organized religion, not a fan. But also because I define these as crimes against humanity. I am with the side that says that the churches should be held accountable legally and morally for what they did in the past. The still living people who committed these crimes should be held accountable. And there's also debate going around about whether they should lose their tax exempt status. Yes, they should, but that's my opinion, okay? Anyone who wants to look into this, please do. I definitely encourage that you do. As I keep saying, read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and talk to people in the respective Indigenous communities, and especially those that are close to your part of the geography. Like, okay, I am currently sitting on Attawandaron land. You know, my city is the traditional territory, or is part of the traditional territory of the Attawandaron people, as well as a number of other people groups. So those would be the people I would go to, theoretically. All right, next one. Maximize. Call to action number 27. We call upon the Federation of Law Societies of Canada to ensure that lawyers receive appropriate cultural competency training, which includes the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal Crown relations. This will require skills-based training in 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 intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. Okay, so basically, this one is saying that lawyers, especially, need to have education that is cross-cultural, based on the legal systems and the cultural customs of all the different people groups surrounding us. In Canada alone, before the settlers and colonizers got here, there were upwards of 500 different people groups, okay? Most of which, although some of them formed confederacies, most of which would have had different law systems. I want to talk to you in particular about one confederacy called the Iroquois Confederacy. It consists, and it is on the center to eastern seaboard of Canada and America. It consists of 5 different nations, which all got together and said, we're going to form an alliance and we are going to form our own code of law. And all 5 of the nations decided to live by this code of law. And the Iroquois Confederacy, perk up your ears, Americans, the Iroquois Confederacy was very, very much involved in forming the American Constitution. The American Constitution, I wouldn't say word for word, but it is pretty much ripped from the law code of the Iroquois Confederacy. Go back, read up on your history. The founding fathers actually deferred to the authority of Indigenous chiefs of these nations in order to say, hey, should we put this in the Constitution? Should we not? What about this? What do you think? You know, and the whole idea of the equality of humankind, you know, all of the really good stuff in the Constitution, that came from the Iroquois Confederacy. Go do your reading, people. Thank you. So I think it's very important, especially nowadays, to recognize the incredible importance that these nations played in forming out North American law, at least as applies to Canada and America, because as I say, these nations crossed what we would call our national boundaries. You know, for example, the Cree Nation, they're freaking huge. There are Cree up here, and there are Cree as far south as Florida. They did not recognize the same national or international boundaries that we do. And a lot of what happened when drawing up the respective maps of Canada and America, we put boundary lines so as to separate Indigenous nations from one another. So, right down Cree territory, right down Mi'kmaq territory, you know, like all these different nations that went between provinces and states and even between countries. We didn't draw the boundary lines just to divide and conquer nations. That wasn't the only reason why they were drawn the way they were. A lot of it was also land dispute between the white governments of Canada and America, and especially to do with water. Look at how the Great Lakes are divided, for example. And personally, I think America got the long end of that stick, but there you go. But whatever. Canada, I think, has more water overall than America does, like more fresh, potable water. That was also a very big part of it. But history is a complicated thing, and it's never going to be just one factor that leads to one result. Never. So do your reading. Thank you. Next. Boop. All right. Call to action number 28. We call upon law schools in Canada to require all law students to take a course in Aboriginal people and the law, which includes the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal Crown relations. This will require skills-based training in international competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. Okay. This one is quite similar to the last, but this one refers specifically to students. I'm going to go pretty far afield here and talk about China for a second. In the Analects of Confucius, okay, and Confucianism is not only a religion and a philosophy, but it is also a form of legal code, or it can be read as such. But Confucius says that in order to help people stick to the law, we need to educate them from their youngest years in what the law is, how it functions, and how it keeps society together. So in this case, with law students, basically what I'm reading here is that it's important for them to understand the diversity of the laws of the nations surrounding them. And I don't personally think it should just be one course, because a course in university, at least in Canada, can last upwards of 4 months. That is not long enough to understand the entire depth and history and breadth of these laws, especially since, as I said before, a lot of the Indigenous legal codes, plural, influenced a lot of our legal codes, also plural. But that gets down from federal to provincial / state and territorial to municipal legal codes, you know, and things will differ on all of these levels. As I say, things will also differ between Indigenous nations. So there's no right way to do this. But the wrong way to do this is to completely write those societies out of history and say your history does not matter. Your history as a people does not matter. We're here now and we're the ones making the laws, so fluff off. That is the wrong approach. That is racist. And one of the points that the TRC makes is that we should be emphasizing anti-racism. Please recognize the history of the people around you. Okay? This is not to say that we shouldn't see race, we shouldn't see color, because in my view at least, to deny the existence of the separation of races is to deny the history of said races. So it's important to get this cross-cultural education so that we don't automatically fluff off the quote other. All right, next. Babe. Number 29. Okay, we call upon the parties and, in particular, the federal government to work collaboratively with plaintiffs not included in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement to have disputed legal issues determined expeditiously on an agreed set of facts. Okay. This is the one that I'm shakiest on for these particular 5. But to me, this speaks to the right to a speedy trial. You know how that's written into, most law codes nowadays, that people have the right to a fair and speedy trial? This isn't necessarily going to be the case if you're trying to, get a dispute settled, even disputes that don't have to do with abuses in residential schools, but those haven't even been close to being scratched, like the surface of those, and the problem is a lot of these disputes are going to come down to the individual level rather than the collective level. The reason why I say that the Catholic Church as a body should pay reparations, should have their tax-exempt status taken away, is because in some sense, it's easier to prosecute a body than it is to prosecute an individual. But in the Indigenous groups, different people are going to have different grievances when it comes to residential school treatment, as well as when it comes to every other kind of crime that they could be prosecuted for, or they could want to prosecute someone in non-Indigenous communities for. So the whole thing about the right to a fair and speedy trial is basically so that evidence is never convoluted and cannot accidentally go against you. If you leave a gap of, say, 40 years between a crime being committed versus when you try that person or that group, there's going to be a lot of room in which to meddle with or muddle up the evidence for that crime. And memories are also going to start to fade. People may even start dying, which is what has happened with the residential school system. As I say, though the last one, at least in Canada, closed in 1997, this was a system that went on for over 100 years. So there's obviously going to be people who are dead who cannot be prosecuted for their crimes, which is why in this case I say you should prosecute the Catholic Church as a body and also prosecute individuals who are still living for their contribution to these crimes. But when it comes to trying Indigenous people specifically for crimes, the whole idea of the right to a fair and speedy trial is also so that they are not wrongfully indicted for things that they may not have done. Which I think leads nicely into our last point. This is the benefit of having done this video already. I have some foresight of what's coming. But maximizing. Last point for today, call to action number 30. We call upon federal, provincial, and territorial governments to commit to eliminating the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in custody over the next decade, and to issue detailed annual reports that monitor and evaluate progress in doing so. Okay, so what I literally just said about being prosecuted wrongfully, yeah, that plays into this point really, really well, because there is a severe overrepresentation in both Canadian and American prisons of non-white people. This is honestly due, flat out, I am not going to butter this up, this is to do with racism. People who are not white are much more likely to be tried and much, much more likely to be convicted for committing the same crime as a white person. So let's take Grand Theft Auto for an example, okay? White guy steals a car. Indigenous guy steals a car. White guy, okay, well, what were the circumstances under which he stole the car? How much money does he have to bribe the judge or the jury? Indigenous guy, same questions, only framed in a different way. And the problem is racism. The problem is also money, okay? As we have seen before in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there is a vast gap in wealth between Indigenous groups and white groups, okay? White people have the long-standing and systemically allowed advantage in both of these things. You know, you're going to look at whether the white guy has a family, you know, what he did the crime for. Grand Theft Auto might be a bad example. Okay, let's say theft, okay? Just monetary theft. Why did he steal the money? Versus with the Indigenous guy, it's going to be different. You know, people and police, we are seeing this as a systemic issue in Canada and America right now. Police, unfortunately, are much quicker to the trigger with non-white people than they are with white people. This is systemic racism. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. This is systemic racism. You saw it happen with George Floyd. He was black. The same thing happens in the Indigenous communities. It really does. And you hear all the time about people being shot on false pretenses. You hear all the time of people having unfair and biased trials, which is why in our courts we attempt to form out the most unbiased jury as we possibly can. That doesn't always work because, unfortunately, you might not be able to get into a person's heart. You know, they might get someone on the jury who just refuses to play ball, and that is due to their own sense of privilege, their own racism. You know, it can be due to multiple different factors, but really, I do boil this one down to racism flat out, and not just interpersonal racism, you know, the racism of individuals, but to systemic racism. Indigenous people and non-white people in general are much more likely to be both tried and convicted of the same crime as a white person. That and the fact that they will also generally serve longer prison terms than their white counterpart who commit the same crime, okay? Look into these crime statistics. Try to go on websites and to get sources that don't come at this issue from either the political left or the political right, because both of those sides, and I freely admit this even as a leftist, both of those sides can have biases. Personally, I find the left to be more objective about these things, and that's one of the reasons why I'm a leftist. But, I mean, this happens all over the place. I mean, you know, one of the points of leftism is trying to make people into equals, which is good, but we can also stretch our privilege, quite frankly, to say, you know, the narrative that we want to put forward. But neither narrative of the left or the right is necessarily objective. So try to find objective sources. I would go, if you live in Canada, I would go on StatsCan. But you got to remember that to everything that is published, there's always going to be a political element, always, no matter what it is. I mean, it could be a pamphlet, it could be an ad in a grocery store. You know, it all boils down to the politics of the person who has published the thing. And you can't trace that back all the way to the source. You really can't in a lot of these cases. So try to be as objective as you can be, and also do your research, as I keep saying. And I'm going to keep pounding that point into your heads because I love you all and I want you to be well informed. And I'm trying to get better informed myself. Gods know I'm not the final authority on any of this. You really want the final authority on all of this? Read the TRC, but also talk to Indigenous people. And that's my advice to you for today, as has been my long-standing advice throughout this series. All right, so that is calls to action, numbers 26 through 30, and I remembered to hit record this time. Yay! Tomorrow, we shall have calls to action, numbers 31, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Sweet. All right, have a lovely afternoon. Very happy it stopped thunderstorming out. I can't make videos when it's thunderstorming. I'm sorry, I'm afraid of lightning. But yeah, I will see you all tomorrow. Have a lovely afternoon. Mwah!